Hey guys, welcome back to Super Top 10s. Today we'll talk about why Final Fantasy XVI will be the best Final Fantasy. Let's head into it. Number 9. The new game.
So, Cloud, you were a soldier first class, right?
Yeah.
Every new Final Fantasy game, there's always a conversation about what exactly a Final Fantasy game is. And yet, that's the beauty of the series. It spans so many themes and settings and stories, that which Final Fantasy is her favorite continues to be a heated debate among fans on the franchise. Bearing quite a few other differences, one of the biggest conversations is between Final Fantasy games that embrace modern tech alongside with magic, and those that sit in a more classic high fantasy setting. The newly revealed Final Fantasy XVI is taking things back to the original fantasy themes, a huge departure from the prior game that literally included a car that could fly. But there's a lot more evidence aside from just the visuals seen in the trailer that fans of Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy Tactics should pay attention to Final Fantasy XVI. Summed up in a thread by @DreamBoom on Twitter, the team working on Final Fantasy XVI is very different from those who have made the last decade or so of Final Fantasy games. Number 8. The developing team.
Shiva's dominant. And only the dominant.
First of all, they point out to the team behind Final Fantasy XVI, Creative Business Unit 3. No, it's not the catchy developer name at all, but it's also the team responsible for Final Fantasy XIV. And yes, while that is an MMO, those who have played it agree it is arguably the best Final Fantasy narrative ever. This isn't the Hajime Tabaras, Tetsuya Nomura's, or Yoshinori Kitase's of the Square Enix world. Creative Business Unit 3 comes from a very different lineage in general. This is a different breed of Final Fantasy developer. Basically, no one involved in Final Fantasy 13 or 15 is making creative decisions on this project. Number 7. The main developer.
The ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake is unexpected, a little confusing, and very, very meta.
Heading up Creative Business Unit 3 is Naoki Yoshida, famed for turning Final Fantasy XIV around with the A-Realm Reborn and his continued expansion and support. It was that very feat that put him in charge of this studio. Yoshida specifically said he prefers the fantasy settings of Final Fantasy over the modern tech integration, evident in Final Fantasy XIV's development. The Twitter thread explains he wants to go back to a time of sword and sorcery, and summons the series used to be known for. Think Final Fantasy 3, 5, 6, 9, and Tactics. Number 6. Inspirations.
You seek my approval, do you?
Some of Yoshida's favorite games and inspirations: Tactics Ogre, Final Fantasy Tactics, Vagrant Story, and Final Fantasy XII. The Twitter thread points out that these are all dark, political stories mostly focusing on medieval setting. The lineage of development from Final Fantasy XII that was so influential on 14 is being further pulled to 16. So if these are your favorite Final Fantasy games too, rest assured that not only is the studio headed by someone who agrees, its team is filled with experienced people who have worked on these very projects. Number 5. Director. While Yoshida helms the studio and acts as a producer, Final Fantasy XVI is being directed by Hiroshi Takai, who helped Yoshida with the big Final Fantasy XIV turnaround. He's been with the Final Fantasy series since Final Fantasy V, through all of its ups and downs, but the thread reminds us that he was involved in the Saga series and also directed The Last Remnant to get a better understanding of outside influences beyond just Final Fantasy. Again, it's an experience in medieval high fantasy. Number 4. The Battle Director. These are the only 2 confirmed figures on the project right now, but @DreamBoom goes on to give educated projections of who else is most likely working on Final Fantasy XVI. First up, Ryota Suzuki, who they say is most assuredly the battle director of Final Fantasy XVI. Suzuki was originally at Capcom for 2 decades, and has worked on both Devil May Cry 5 and Dragon's Dogma, if that gives you an idea for his battle system experience. Number 3. The team. The thread further speculates that the team behind Final Fantasy XIV, Heavensward, was transitioned to Final Fantasy XVI development once the expansion was shipped. They base this assumption on the fact that Takai is involved in the project. This team may include Final Fantasy XIV writer Kazutoyo Mihiro, assistant director Mitsutoshi Gondai, illustrator and concept artist Kazuya Takahashi, and character designer Tsubara Masao. @DreamBoom points out again that this is speculation and unconfirmed. Going further into speculation, they say the trailer music sounds like Fantasy XIV composer Masayoshi Soken's work, again unconfirmed at this time. Number 2. Additional information. The rest of the thread goes on to talk about Yasumi Matsuno's influence, the mind behind Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre, and progenitor of Final Fantasy narratives taking a darker and more political turn. It's clear from the trailer that Final Fantasy XVI is both quite dark and political, so while Matsuno may not be directly involved, his influence is certainly carrying through its DNA. It's well worth reading through those additional details in the thread to see how Final Fantasy XVI compares so far to games like Vagrant Story. Number 1. Conclusion. The short of it is, if you've enjoyed what the team has done with the Final Fantasy XIV since A Realm Reborn and yearn for the dark political themes and high fantasy settings of classic Final Fantasy games like Tactics, Final Fantasy XVI should be one to keep on your radar. Gone are the flying car road trips of Final Fantasy XV and the bright overindulgent settings of Final Fantasy XIII. This is a return to classic Final Fantasy in a way single-player Final Fantasy games haven't seen in decades. Overall, I think it's safe to say it is going to be the best Final Fantasy game. What do you think about Final Fantasy XVI? Do you think it will be the best Final Fantasy game? Let us know in the comments below. This brings us to the end of our video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss any of our videos in the future. Also, watch the 2 videos that are on your screen because I'm sure you'll love them. With that, I'll see you in the next video.